All right, so today we're going to dust off those shoulder pads and leg warmers for a deep dive into the 5 count.
Sounds like a blast from the past. Is that the podcast dedicated to all things 80s and 90s?
Yeah, it's like a love letter to those decades, with all the music, the movies, the fashion faux pas, the works.
Well, color me intrigued. Based on the episode script you shared, it looks like they're aiming for those Gen Xers and older millennials who actually lived through those glory days.
Totally. But it's more than just a nostalgia trip. We're talking listener mail, debates about Howard the Duck, and some seriously funny banter between the hosts.
So they're bringing the humor, too. That's smart. It's got to be tough to navigate that line between celebrating the past and, well, acknowledging some of the more questionable aspects of those eras.
Absolutely. But that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right? The script gives us a glimpse into how the 5 count uses humor and its format to create this sense of community around those shared memories. Like we were all there.
All right, let's unpack this time capsule, shall we? First up, who are these voices guiding us through this blast from the past?
Okay, so we've got the hunk host, as the script calls him. Imagine this, deep, reflective voice that makes even a discussion about Garbage Pail Kids sound profound.
I'm picturing, Don LaFontaine narrating a Trapper Keeper commercial.
Exactly. And he genuinely believes the 80s and 90s were the peak of civilization.
Of course he does. Gotta love that unwavering nostalgia.
And then there's the comedic host, bringing the energy, the 90s trivia, keeping things light.
So the walking encyclopedia of everything from boy bands to Beanie Babies.
Spot on. They're like a human time capsule, just bursting with pop culture references.
The script already hints at how their personalities play off each other. I'm sensing some real comedic chemistry there.
Oh, absolutely. They're like that classic comedic duo, but instead of slapstick, they're riffing on the glory days of slap bracelets.
That's a great analogy. It's that dynamic that makes or breaks a podcast, wouldn't you say?
Totally. It's not just two people agreeing with each other. You want that back and forth, that debate, that journey back in time with all its triumphs and questionable fashion choices.
Speaking of questionable fashion choices, the script mentions they have a whole bit about the Garbage Pail Kids movie being older than most of their listeners.
Oh, yeah. They actually say that in the intro.
Now, that's interesting. I mean, it's a pretty obscure movie to begin with, but it also highlights this interesting tension, right? The things we remember from our childhood, no matter how bizarre, are now considered vintage or retro.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that time marches on, even for Garbage Pail Kids.
They're not just reliving the past. They're acknowledging how it shapes our present, how those memories inform who we are today.
Okay, so we've got the hosts, this dynamic duo. But what about the format of the show itself? How do they structure all this nostalgia?
Well, they seem to follow a pretty classic podcast structure. They've got their opening banter, setting the stage for some 80s, 90s themed deep dive.
And then it's on to the main event. What do they call it? The 5 count mailbag.
Yep, that's the one. This is where they answer questions, play voicemails, and really lean into that listener interaction.
I'm getting that classic radio call-in show vibe, but updated for the podcasting age,
Exactly. It's all about creating that sense of community, that feeling of being part of a larger conversation.
Like they're building a virtual clubhouse for anyone who remembers the thrill of finding a holographic Charizard card.
Perfect analogy. And, in today's podcasting landscape, that's crucial.
It's not enough to just deliver content anymore. You need to create that connection, that sense of belonging, that feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself.
They even include some examples of listener questions in the script, like one from Madam Nikki asking about their first concert experiences.
Oh, wait, that's a good one. Everyone remembers their first concert.
It's like a rite of passage, a memory that stays with you. I wonder if their answers reveal something deeper about their personalities or musical tastes,
Well, the hunk host went full-on rock star, seeing Bon Jovi at 14, complete with a leather jacket that was way too big for him.
Classic. You can practically hear Living on a Prayer playing in the background.
And the comedic host. Their first concert was Weird Al Yankovic.
Seriously?
No, seriously. They said they walked in a boy and walked out. Well, still boy, but one who suddenly understood the magic of the accordion.
That is amazing. It totally fits their persona.
Right. It's like, who else would have Weird Al as their first concert? It just makes sense.
And it's a great example of how they use personal anecdotes to connect with their audience. It shows vulnerability, a willingness to share something of themselves.
Totally. And those personal stories are a great way to break down that wall between performer and listener.
Yeah.
It makes them feel more relatable, more human.
It's like they're saying, hey, we're just like you. We have embarrassing memories. We made questionable fashion choices, but we survived and we're here to laugh about it together.
Exactly. And that shared laughter, that shared experience is what builds that sense of community.
It's like they've created a time machine out of pop culture references and inside jokes, and everyone who tunes in gets to take a ride.
Okay, so we've got the hosts, the format, and this awesome community vibe. But what about the deeper themes driving the 5 count? How do they use nostalgia and humor to create such a compelling listening experience?
Now we're getting to the heart of it. Let's dive into how the 5 count taps into those universal feelings of longing for the past, while also acknowledging, the humor and maybe even the cringe-worthy aspects of those bygone eras. It's kind of like they're walking this tightrope, between celebrating the 80s and 90s and gently poking fun at them.
Yeah, it's like, hey, we love these decades, but let's be real, some things were just bad.
Exactly. It's that self-awareness that makes it feel more authentic, more relatable.
Like they're in on the joke, right?
Totally. They're not afraid to say, remember those parachute pants? Yeah, we all thought those were cool once. It's that shared experience of looking back and realizing that maybe, just maybe, some things are better left in the past.
But it never feels mean-spirited or anything.
Right. It's more like they're laughing with their listeners, not at them.
Exactly. It's like, we were all there, we all made those questionable choices, but hey, at least we had fun doing it.
And that's what makes the humor so effective, right? It's relatable, it's disarming, it creates this sense of solidarity among listeners.
It's like, hey, we're all in this together, we all survived the 80s and 90s, and we're stronger for it.
And the script actually mentions how this seems to really resonate with listeners.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, it suggests that it appeals to people who might have like a complex relationship with that time in their lives. Maybe they cringe at some of the fashion choices or musical trends, but there's still a fondness for those simpler times.
Makes sense. It's like, I can't believe I wore that, but man, those were the days.
Exactly. And the 5 count really captures that sentiment. It's a celebration of the good, the bad, and the oh so very ugly of those decades.
Which brings us to another key ingredient in their recipe for podcasting success: listener interaction.
Ah, yes. The lifeblood of any good podcast.
They really make your audience feel like they're a part of the show.
It's one of the things that sets podcasting apart from other forms of media.
It's that intimacy, right? That feeling of being part of a conversation.
Exactly. And the 5 count really leans into that. We see it in the 5 count mailbag segment where they answer listener questions, play voicemails, even encourage call-ins during their live recordings.
Oh, right. Like that whole debate about Alf versus Howard the Duck in a cage match.
Exactly. It's hilarious, but it also speaks to their ability to create this space where listeners feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and opinions, no matter how outlandish.
It's like they're building a virtual water cooler where people can gather and chat about everything from their first concert experiences to, the questionable plot lines of 80s sci-fi movies.
And it works because it taps into this fundamental human need for connection, for belonging.
We're social creatures, even if we're listening to podcasts alone in our headphones.
Exactly. And the 5 count seems to understand that. They're not just entertaining their audience. They're making them feel seen, heard, and valued.
It's a smart move, for sure. Especially in a podcasting landscape that's getting more and more crowded.
It's not enough to just have great content anymore.
You need to create a community.
Give people a reason to stick around.
And the 5 count definitely seems to have cracked the code.
They've figured out how to leverage the intimacy and interactivity of the podcast format to create this really special space where people can connect over shared experiences and, those warm, fuzzy feelings of nostalgia.
It's like they've created time capsule, but instead of burying it in the ground, they've opened it up and invited everyone inside.
I love that analogy. It's not just about preserving the past, it's about bringing it to life, sharing it with others.
Maybe even rediscovering something about ourselves in the process. But how do they wrap up each episode? What's their sign-off like? Is it just a quick thanks for listening and they're out of there?
Oh no, they don't just say goodbye and leave you hanging. The script shows they actually end each episode with this kind of thought-provoking question, something to really make you think.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, and it's not just like a random question out of the blue either. It always ties back to the themes of the show.
So it keeps that conversation going even after the episode is over.
Exactly. It's like they're extending that virtual Clubhouse experience, prompting listeners to reflect on their own experiences with the 80s and 90s.
Okay, so what's the question they leave us with in this particular script?
They ask, If you could time travel back to the 80s or 90s, what pop culture event would you absolutely have to experience?
Oh, that's a good one.
And then they followed up with, and what fashion faux pas would you warn your younger self against?
That's hilarious. It's like, who wouldn't want to go back and give their younger self a fashion makeover?
Right. On the surface, it's just a fun thought experiment. But there's actually a deeper layer there.
Oh, I see it. It makes you think about the things that shaped you, those experiences that made you who you are today.
Exactly. Like, would you try to prevent yourself from making those fashion mistakes? Or would you embrace the awkwardness, knowing that it's all part of the journey?
Man, that's a tough one. I mean, part of me wants to go back and tell my younger self to avoid those neon jelly shoes at all costs. But then again,
You're kind of cool back then.
exactly. It's like, it's all part of who we are, right? The good, the bad, the totally embarrassing.
And I think that's what the Five Count does so well. They tap into that complex mix of nostalgia, humor, and self-reflection.
They're not just celebrating the past, they're inviting us to re-examine it, to appreciate how it shaped who we are today.
It's like they're saying, hey, those decades may be gone, but the memories, the music, the lessons we learned along the way, those stay with us.
And sometimes it's good to look back and laugh at ourselves a little, right?
Absolutely. It's all part of the fun.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Five Count, I think the main takeaway here is that it's much more than just a podcast about the 80s and 90s.
It's a celebration of those shared experiences, a reminder of the power of nostalgia, and a testament to how important it is to connect with others over those moments that, made us laugh, cringe, and ultimately grow.
It's a reminder that even though those decades might be gone, they're not really gone. They're still with us, shaping who we are.
So if you're looking for a podcast that'll transport you back in time, make you laugh, and maybe even teach you a thing or two about yourself, I highly recommend checking out The Five Count.
You might just find yourself digging out those old cassette tapes and realizing that maybe, just maybe, the 80s and 90s weren't so bad after all.